And we are live. Welcome back, everybody. People are joining. Yes, feel free to turn on your videos to say hi. Maybe type in the chat which parts you're starting with today. We hope you had a lot of ventral vagal activation during the week. So just one minute of announcements from my side. So today we meet again for 3 hours. So we stay until 9 p.m. Central Europe, which is 3 p.m. The East Coast. And there will be one 15-minute break in the middle. And you will hear the music at the end of it, so you know when to come back. Schedule and handouts for today are already in your emails, and we will put them on chat just so you have them at hand at all times. Practice of today, we will have meditation, journaling, a few didactic pieces, 2 video clips to discuss and analyze, and of course, plenty of space for answering your questions. We will also have a 12-minute breakout rooms for sharing. So if you cannot take part in them, just let us know before, early in the private message. But we highly encourage you to take part in these short breakouts to connect with other people here. We are recording this workshop as every week, but your video will not be visible in the final version of it. We are spotlighting Lexi, our trainer, and we'll send you the recording just like we did last Tuesday. Next Tuesday, it's coming your way with unlimited access to it. Feel free to ask your questions to make it even more practical, more engaging, and do it so by raising your virtual hand or by typing them in the chat. Lexi is super proficient in picking them up and answering them on the go. So there will be space for this. So thank you again for being here. And now I'm inviting Lexi to begin the second part of our 4-week journey. Enjoy.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you all last week to start our journey together. I've really been looking forward to seeing you again and continuing this exploration of the integration of IFS and polyvagal theory. And in case you were needing a little bit of ventral vagal activation, I have provided you with my cat here. This is my 4-year-old Tamino, and I just find his paws really adorable in this picture. So before we get started, there were some questions, that came up in the chat last week. Some of them I just answered live during the workshop. The ones that I didn't get to answer, I did take a look at after the workshop ended last week. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to address 2 of those leftover questions right now. A few more will sort of get answered organically today or next week. There are a couple of them. I think both of them might have been submitted by Noemi, but they're going to be addressed in next week's workshop. So I didn't forget about them. They just will come up organically as we talk about the material next week and view some video segments, and they were just so relevant to her questions. So I'm going to hold those. So the 2 that I want to talk about right now, Sam had asked in the chat last time whether I would ever consider doing a podcast episode with Deb Dana to sort of discuss IFS and polyvagal theory together. And I actually have done that. So I wanted to let you all know that you can find that episode on my website. I'm going to try to put a link here to there's a podcast page on my website, which is dralexiarothman.com. There's a podcast page. And on that page, you can find 11 different interviews that I did with my co-host, Anibal Enriquez, who you may know from IFS Talks. He also is the co-host of that podcast. And we interviewed some IFS people like Dick Schwartz and Martha Sweezy, Bob Falconer, Joanne Twombly, and also some people whose work could be linked to our IFS work in some way. So people like Daniel Four, Lou Cozzolino, and Deb Dana. So there was an interview, I think it was maybe August 5th of 2021 with her, and you can hear us talking about these issues and some of the things that I'll be saying in the workshop. You'll hear from our discussion there. Another question that had come up in the chat last time, we were talking about these different states that our nervous system can take us to. So we were talking about fight, flight, freeze, shut down, collapse. And someone asked, well, what about fawning? How can we understand fawn? And so I wanted to say a little bit about that. That is a situation where a person has learned to skillfully recruit their social engagement system to send cues of safety to the nervous system of another person who is in some way dangerous to them, but they're also having to be somewhat dependent on that person in some way. So they're sending these cues of safety to help keep that other person's nervous system regulated so that that person will be less dangerous to them. So a child, for example, may have to learn to do this, to hide their own feelings, to hide their own needs, and just show up in the way that the parent needs them to in order to reduce the chances that the parent will get dysregulated and that the parent might get abusive with them, or in hostage situations, domestic violence situations. So Deb Dana has said, and I do agree with her, that the term fawning isn't a great term, nor terms like Stockholm syndrome, not great terms, because they don't really properly honor the fact that the person is skillfully using their social engagement system to read the cues of others and then to adjust accordingly and then to send the necessary cues or do the necessary behaviors to keep the situation safer. So maybe the term appeasement or appeasement behaviors, that other people have used that term, that might be a bit better. And in terms of the nervous system and what may be happening there, they're really relying on that ventral vagal pathway, on the social engagement system, and possibly also on the dorsal pathway a little bit, because the dorsal can help immobilize the defensive strategies of fight or flight. So they're not fighting with this person. They're not fleeing, maybe because they can't flee, or maybe because fighting would have made it worse. So they're having to downregulate that so that they don't go into fight or flight with a person that could be dangerous if that would make it worse. But then really over relying on that social engagement system, which means it can be draining for them. Usually our manager parts, sometimes our self-like parts might take on these roles where they're really skillfully conveying the cues and shape-shifting and walking on eggshells and all the things that we might need to do. So what I've seen in clients who've had to use this a lot in their lives is sometimes they get so disconnected from their own wants and needs and desires and their own preferences, and maybe they struggle to set appropriate boundaries. So the IFS process of helping them actually connect with their parts is just life-changing in terms of really being able to get to know themselves in their fullness, their own wants, needs, preferences, desires, be able to set self-led boundaries with others. So IFS can work beautifully, with people who've had to use their systems in this way, where it was necessary. So, like I said, other questions we'll get to as we go. Last week, we discussed some of the basics of polyvagal theory. We drew some parallels between IFS and polyvagal theory. And this week, we're going to go further and move even more so from the theoretical to the more practical. So how can we use what polyvagal theory tells us about the nervous system to make our work with clients safer, to make it more effective? And we did start touching on that at the end of our last session, because we were discussing how important it is to try to help clients, when possible, to access that critical mass of self, which is roughly equivalent to anchoring in the ventral vagal state of regulation, before we go too far toward having them befriend parts that live in or use survival states. How important it is to be anchored in regulation before we're dipping our toes into survival, and re-anchoring in regulation as we need to. So getting access to self, unblending, again, as we need to, as we're working with these states. And we'll be talking about that topic in various ways throughout the whole series. Today, our main emphasis will be in two areas. One, we're going to be discussing the concept of co-regulation, both from a polyvagal and an IFS perspective. And two, we'll be talking about hyper-aroused parts and some recommendations for working with these types of parts in IFS. And we're going to see two segments today from a therapy session that I did with a client where we're moving toward working with a part of him that is very much associated with the sympathetic survival state, specifically the fight state in his nervous system. And of course, we're going to have our meditation in a moment, but I'd like to kind of help set that up for you so that maybe you can get the most out of it. So I'm just going to talk about one slide first to sort of set up the meditation, and then we will transition there. Okay. So when someone has some access to self or is regulated by ventral in polyvagal terms, they're able to engage, they're able to connect with others and send cues of safety, through their eyes, through their facial expressions, their tone of voice, posture, gestures. So all these different nonverbal channels. So when we're in the presence of someone who has some access to self, and they're sending those cues of safety to us, which is, of course, what we're wanting to do for our clients, then, interacting with a person like that, who in that moment has a foothold in regulation, is really good for our nervous system. Their presence, the cues that they're sending to us, help shift our nervous system into regulation. However, when we're doing our work as therapists, as practitioners, our clients might be doing the very opposite to us when they're sitting with us. So they might be in that moment, stuck in adaptive survival states. So maybe they're sending cues to our nervous system that can be picked up as cues of danger. So we could be dealing with hyper aroused clients. Maybe they're very angry, they're raging, they're overwhelmingly anxious, they're panicked, they're obsessing and ruminating, or actively terrified, Or we could be with hypo-aroused clients. They might have very low energy. They might be speaking and moving very slowly. Maybe they're not speaking at all. They're disconnected, they're numb, they're sleepy, they're dissociated. So if our clients are in states like those, and therefore they're sending cues to our nervous system that could be picked up as cues of danger, it might cause activation of parts of us that might live in those survival states themselves, or parts of us that know how to activate those survival states for our own protection and have done that when they've needed to. So we then, in our sessions with our clients, we might find ourselves moving out of regulation, losing access to self, and becoming blended with parts as we're sitting with our clients. So we could find ourselves moving into a more sympathetically charged place. So maybe we're getting anxious or frustrated or getting into problem-solving mode or fix-it mode, or being agitated or irritable, impatient, maybe even wanting to escape and get out of the session if we could. Or maybe we might find ourselves being drawn more down towards our dorsal survival state. So maybe we're feeling sleepy or drained, losing focus or concentration, losing our ability to care. So Dick calls those people in our lives who activate our parts our tormentors, because they are our teachers, they're our mentors. So they show us where we might have some work to do. Maybe there's someone in us who needs attention, someone in us who needs some healing, parts of us that might need to develop more of a close or connected relationship with us, with ourselves, so that they don't take over and lead our systems for us, including during sessions. So as IFS therapists and practitioners, ideally we'd be learning to notice when parts of us become activated by clients so that we shift out of our self-presence or regulation, and we would be learning to turn toward them with curiosity and compassion and do our own work with them so that we can be there for our clients in a self-led way, no matter what state their nervous system is in that moment. So since this is a lifelong journey for all of us, what we're going to do in our meditation today is actually see if we can notice, come into some awareness of, maybe even connect with one or more of our own parts that can get activated in response to clients who are hyper aroused. And then after the meditation, after we do that sort of working meditation, you'll have a couple minutes to journal about whatever you noticed or whatever you might have learned in your own system. And then some time in breakout rooms, 12 minutes to share with, 1, 2, or 3 colleagues about what you notice, if you feel comfortable doing that, or about anything else, whatever feels right for you. So we'll go ahead and move to our meditation. So if you'd like to turn off your cameras for privacy, certainly you can do that. Either way. And if you'd like to participate, you can go ahead and get into a comfortable position. Adjusting your body in whatever way feels right in this moment. And allowing your eyes to close, if that feels okay. And begin that shift from outside to inside. Toward becoming aware of what's happening in your internal system. And as you're doing that, I'd like to invite you to bring to mind a person, preferably a client. If you have one, you can use here, but it can also be someone else. It's someone that you've interacted with while they were stuck in some sort of hyper-aroused state. And where their presence or energy while they were in that state was activating for your system in some way. So maybe there's someone who could become highly anxious, agitated, desperate, frightened, intense. Or maybe they carry or convey a lot of frustrated or angry or rageful energy. Maybe someone who speaks so fast, so much, it's hard to get a word in when you're interacting with them. So just take a moment to land on someone. And once you have a person in mind, put them in a room as you stay outside the room, looking in at them through a window, so they can't see you. They don't know that you're there. And as you look at them, just imagine them doing whatever they do that causes the reactivity in your system. However they act or however they present when they're in a hyper-aroused state. And as they're doing that, just notice what happens in you, physiological shifts, thoughts, or emotions. And turn your attention to the strongest reaction you're noticing in your system. Whether it's physical sensation, a thought, a feeling, let it know that you're noticing it there. And in whatever way feels right, let it know you'd be interested in getting to know it a little bit, if that's okay. And if it doesn't seem receptive in this moment, that's completely okay. We don't want to force anything. You can either stay with this part at whatever distance feels right to it and just start to establish some trust, between the two of you. Or you can move to another part that's reacting to the person's energy. And if the part does seem open, invite it to share with you whatever it would like you to know about its reaction to the energy or to the behavior of the person in the room. And however you can, share with the part your understanding of what it is conveying to you, and just see if it feels that you're really getting what happens for it when the person in the room is in that state. And if the part is a protector, let's ask what it's afraid might happen if it didn't react in the way it does to this person's energy or presence. And if it's an exile, ask it to help you understand just a little bit, maybe give you a little sense of why it reacts in the way it does to this person. And you can let it know that it's not the best time right now to witness the full story, but that you just want to get a little sense of why this person's energy is very activating for it. And let them know that you'll be taking a few moments after the meditation to write down anything they want you to remember from this interaction with them. And if it feels right, you can also set an intention to follow up with them soon. And so give them another few seconds if there's anything else. And just gently say goodbye to these parts for now, just thanking them for whatever they shared with you. You can begin to make your way back to our space. Move around a little if that helps. And if you'd like to, you can grab something to write with. And we'll take about 2 minutes here to do some journaling. And then go to our breakout rooms. Okay, so we're going to put the invitations to move to our breakout rooms, and we'll be there for 12 minutes and then come back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I had wanted to take a minute or so to actually see if there was anyone who might feel comfortable sharing something about their experience. We probably only have time for maybe one person, maybe two people. If there's someone who might like to say anything about what happened, what they noticed in their system in reaction to a person who can be in a very hyper aroused state. So if you'd like to, you can raise your hand if you'd like to share a little bit. Angelique?
Yeah, I was thinking of a group member that was in a aroused state, and maybe last year, and I put a boundary because I was triggered myself because of her anger, so I just set a boundary. So first I was thinking of her, and then I went to another person that I did not have to set a boundary with because I was in a different state. I was in a calm state, so I could stay with the person. So I was checking, oh yeah, that was different. Then I was not in a calm state. I couldn't. I had to, it was somebody who was in a sympathetic state and calling me and projecting. No, not really projecting, but yeah, starting to project. And I set a boundary. And then at the end, I was a small child, and I saw how my father was fighting with my mom very badly, severely. And I was in a freeze state maybe I was 5 years old, and these memories stay with me all the time. And I saw the connection, how I was in a frozen state at that time. And that was actually the original. I felt it really in my heart. It was very, very difficult feeling, like I couldn't breathe anymore. And I felt it's all connected, all related to that time. And the worst is that I don't have contact with my family, because my family is, since a few years since I am in recovery, the connection broke, because I started talking about it and started to show my feelings, because I could never show my feelings as a woman to my family, because because they are in a state of fight state always, and projective state. And now I am, so we broke the connection is broken. It really disrupted the connection. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
And made me sad as well. I'm like, so sad. I don't know how I can fix it.
You were actually able to connect on a lot of different levels in that meditation, and something there was a lot important in there. And one thing just to highlight is it's so neat the way you were able to notice the difference between how you were able to show up in the presence of a hyper-aroused system, depending on what state your system was in. So that's perfect. That really illustrates so much of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, that's also really nice, because it made me aware, maybe now is the time, because if I release my trauma, I release my burden, I can stay calm. I can even stay calm with my family members. That's a time that I can maybe stay calm.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's exactly the work we're all trying to do here. And I'll say a little bit more of that in the teaching, but thank you, because that illustrates it. And Sean, hey.
I hope I've got the concepts right, but I equated the hyperarousal with a client who had quite a lot of firefighter energy, and I got really stuck and couldn't deal with it. I was new to IFS, only a couple of years ago, and And I just could not get a sort of bridge or a working alliance around the firefighter energy. And in the end, the client went away. But I didn't so much get aroused myself, but I went into judgmental aspects. You need to turn up, you need to show up, and also criticisms of myself. I'd lacked skill, and there's a whole series of parts which I've never really taken proper supervision on. So I got that out of the meditation. But then in the middle of that, I had a compassion both for her and for myself. I wanted to know about her firefighter energy. I wanted to help and to give myself some validation for that, because otherwise I felt the unfinished, unresolved frustration with myself as well as her. So I've got some new trailheads, if you like, to work with. So very valuable meditation.
Oh, thank you, Sean. Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we'll transition now into our first didactic piece, and I'm going to try to slow down my pace a little bit because I do realize I am giving a lot of information. So we'll see how slow I can go and still try to cover everything that we need to today. I did notice there were some questions in the chat, and during the breakout rooms, I addressed some of them or all of them that were there at the time. There may be new ones in there. So I will be looking a bit later to address some more if they're in there. So in our last session, we were talking about the fact that what brings suffering for us is when our nervous systems get pulled out of regulation and then stuck in dysregulation. So when we get stuck in these patterns of survival and protection, instead of being in a space where we can be in safety and connection. And we talked about the fact that what we would like to be able to do for our clients in therapy, including in IFS, is try to help reshape the nervous system towards being able to more easily move back into patterns of safety and connection. And toward a place where it's harder for clients to actually get dysregulated in the first place because they are so firmly anchored in regulation that it just takes more to put them into survival places. And in IFS terms, that means we want to help their parts heal and unburden and step down from the extreme roles that they've had to be in so that they're less likely to totally hijack the system. They're there, they're included as part of our internal family, they're valuable, they're lending their qualities and resources, we're appreciating them, but they're less likely to just take over and run things for us. So today we want to talk more specifically about how what we do in IFS can be informed and guided by what polyvagal tells us about the nervous system. So in the words of Dr. Stephen Porges, he says, trauma sidetracks the development of autonomic regulation in our early development. So what that means is that if we don't get what we need early in life, or if we get a lot of things that are harmful to us as we're developing, then we don't develop the ability to regulate our nervous system as effectively as do those who did get their needs met consistently, were not traumatized early in life. So our systems can be profoundly impacted in negative ways if we're not treated as we ideally should be. And that's particularly the case for those of us, for our clients with complex trauma, relational trauma. So they come with histories of abuse, of neglect, abandonment, with an absence of consistent and effective co-regulation with attuned caregivers. But the question, why? Why don't we develop that ability for effective self-regulation if we have histories like this? And then what can we do about that for us, for our clients through IFS? So a huge piece of that puzzle, both in terms of being part of the cause and part of the solution, it involves the concept of co-regulation. So we said last week, the autonomic nervous system operates on 3 organizing principles. We have neuroception that we talked about last week, hierarchy that we'll eventually get to, and co-regulation. So co-regulation involves moments of safe connection with others, You know, the human nervous system is a relational system. So we need connection with others in order to survive, but also in order to learn how to regulate ourselves. So co-regulation, it involves us being able to come into safe connection with a regulated other, either when we're distressed and we're dysregulated, and their care and their support and the regulation of their nervous system helps move us into regulation, or when we're not distressed and we're just enjoying like a safe, comfortable, joyful, energetic, connection with someone else. So this is a picture of my children. You may have guessed this was taken 13 years ago now. So my son, Tyler, he was about 10 days old, and his big sister, Leah, who's been a big source of safe co-regulation for him, she was almost 3. And then here they are again, 10 years after that picture was taken. Let's see if it comes through. So this was in 2020. And if you look closely at Tyler's facial expression, at their hands, you can see they're still co-regulating with each other. So Deb Dana talks about co-regulation as a biological imperative. That means we don't survive without it. And if we do survive without it, it's hard for us to really thrive. So we've heard for decades the stories about the infants suffering neglect in Romanian orphanages, where maybe their needs for, their basic needs for food, for shelter, for clothing had been met, but they didn't have these relationships with caregivers who were emotionally attuned to them and consistently available to help them regulate not only their emotional experience, but to help them regulate their biology. Because it's not just that our emotional experience benefits from this co-regulation, some of our basic biological rhythms, breathing and heart rate and digestion, benefit significantly as well. So some infants will die without co-regulation. Those that survive could be severely impaired. So polyvagal theory tells us that in order for us to develop the neural pathways that allow us to be both biologically and emotionally regulated, that allow us to feel safe enough to seek connection with other people, to feel engaged with life. In order to have that, we need lots of practice exercising our neural circuits of connection. So if we grow up in an environment where we have responsive caregivers and they're consistently attuned to us and they are co-regulating with us, then we get lots of opportunities to exercise our circuits of connection. And the research shows, fortunately, that doesn't have to happen 100% of the time. Our caregivers, or if we're caregivers, we don't have to be perfect and show up in this perfectly attuned, present, wonderful way every time for our kids or whomever. Just about 1/3 of the time, if we're attuned about 1/3 of the time, it's apparently good enough for us to be able to develop this ability to self-regulate effectively. So to translate that into IFS terms, when we're growing up, if we have regular interactions with self-led others, people don't have to be in full out unblended self, just self-led, so their self is present and their parts are not constantly hijacking, then it's less likely our parts are going to get wounded in the first place, because the person is, leading from self and is less likely to really be in an abusive place, let's say, but also if we do get wounded, because it happens, even with self-led caregivers, then the care that we'll receive from them, it helps prevent our wounded parts from taking on burdens and then from being exiled. So that means our protectors have less of a need to have to step up into extreme roles. So therefore, our self remains more available and more accessible to our parts. And so our parts are regularly just bathed in that self energy as we're moving through our life. So that means we're more consistently able to connect to our own parts, other people, the world, and spirit. But if we don't get safe, consistent co-regulation growing up, then from a polyvagal perspective, we don't have the same opportunities to exercise those neural circuits of connection. So they're not as well tuned, so they don't work as efficiently. And if we also learn that if we go and try to reach out for co-regulation. If we learn that, well, there's no point in that because nobody's going to show up for us. Or if we learn, well, it's dangerous to try to get it because what we get back is not helpful, then we have to find other ways to regulate because we're still human. We're still getting dysregulated. We still need the regulation. So then we're turning towards self-regulation to do the job. But the problem is, as children like that, then we're turning towards self-regulation before the circuits that allow us to do that effectively are well developed. So our self-regulation then is often not so effective. So Deb Dana says, then we end up self-regulating for survival. And in those adaptive survival states, we'll experience a disruption of connection from ourselves, from others, from the world and spirit. So translating that to IFS language, if we don't have, self-led others that we're interacting with that are co-regulating with us, our parts are more likely to get wounded to begin with because, we're reaching out for connection, we're getting rejected, abandoned, hurt, criticized. Then the wounded parts don't have anybody to help soothe them or help them make sense of these situations. So they try to make their own meaning about what's happening to them, and they end up taking on burdens. And then other parts are more likely to exile them because they're wounded, they're stuck in these trauma scenes, they're burdened. So then our protectors are taking on extreme roles. And it's so hard then for the protectors to trust self. Sometimes they don't know self is there. So the protectors run our lives. And when the protectors run our lives and we're very often in these survival states, it's harder for us to connect to our parts and others and the world and spirit as consistently. And for some, close to not at all, if things have had to be, configured in a certain way for them to survive. So both IFS and polyvagal theory, in their own words, they're explaining to us, if we don't get effective, consistent co-regulation, we move to patterns of survival and protection rather than patterns of safety, openness, and connection. And interestingly, as much as there's information on this slide that looks, very sad, there's a lot of hope in this. Dick Schwartz has said from the beginning, before we had the polyvagal theory giving us all this neurobiological evidence for his claim, he said, the self is present in all of us, and we can all learn to access it. And many IFS trainers say the self is like the sun behind the clouds. They say on a cloudy day, we can't see the sun, we can't feel its warmth, but when the clouds blow away, there's the sun, perfectly intact, shining its warmth down on us as it does on anybody else, So the hope that I see up here is, even if we didn't originally get what we needed, maybe we didn't, or we did get what we needed, but then we had traumatic experience, that resulted in our nervous systems getting retuned away from safety and connection and more toward protection. As long as we're living in human bodies and we have a nervous system, and if we're alive and breathing and our heart is beating, we have it, then we can exercise our circuits of connection through IFS therapy, through any other effective ways that we choose, and things can get better for us. And maybe that might take a little longer in systems that didn't get much opportunity to exercise those circuits of connection in the first place. But in IFS, we know if we stick with these things long enough, we start to see little drops of self-energy, and then more, and then we can form connections with the parts and do our healing work, and more self becomes available to the system. So this is a little 10-second video clip of the two generations on either side of me in my family. So this is my father with my infant son. And I think it's a really sweet example of co-regulation. I actually live down in Atlanta, Georgia. My parents live up in New York. So when Tyler was 6 weeks old, my father flew down to meet him for the first time. So because it was their first meeting, I had the video camera on just to capture the first meeting. And so my dad is talking to Tyler and he's telling him to smile. And of course, Tyler's no idea what he's saying. He's 6 weeks old. He's actually never smiled before. So I didn't really expect anything to happen. And the words are meaningless to this little baby. But his nervous system, Tyler's nervous system, started picking up on all these cues of safety, of connection, of engagement that my dad was sending through his facial expression, his tone of voice, all this, his smile. And I was so happy I was videotaping because Tyler ended up giving his social smile. And with infants, the smile is not just their mouth, like their little body kind of gets into it too. So play this for you. There we go. So sweet. I love seeing that because obviously I can't go back in time and see exactly what I got as a kid, but that might have been part of it. I'm grateful. So in terms though of what can we do, as IFS therapists and practitioners, what can we do to contribute to the retuning of our clients' nervous systems toward safety and connection and regulation? And of course, we need to start with the presence of the therapist. So this is a quote from Dick Schwartz that I think is really telling in terms of the power of co-regulation in the therapeutic relationship, and it's given in all IFS terminology. So Dick says, I've found that the most important variable in how quickly clients can access their selves is the degree to which I'm self-led. When I can be deeply present to my clients from the core of my being, clients respond as if the resonance of myself were a tuning fork that awakens their own. So being in connection with a regulated other is not only very safe, but it helps regulate our systems. And the good news is, since we all have an undamaged self at our core, it's something that we all have the potential to do, to hold this critical mass or more of self-energy when we're working with our clients. And we are each a work in progress in this regard. We're always kind of moving toward being able to do this more and more. So as we each become more aware of our own parts and more aware of what activates them, and then we develop relationships with them and we do our healing work, we get more and more access to self across more situations, including across more situations with clients who are in various states. And that's part of what we were doing experientially in the meditation today. That's part of the practice of doing that. And I know that, meditations don't always land for everyone, or they might land on one day, not on another. So, your parts may have taken you on a different journey today, but that type of practice, taking time to notice what parts of us are reacting to various clients, to the energies that various clients bring, to the behaviors that different clients bring, and then turning toward those parts in the way that we did, doing some connecting with them, doing healing work if we need to. That's in the IFS way, what allows us to increasingly hold self-presence with our clients. And something else Dick has said is, he said, I've learned that my relationship with clients is terribly important to our success because my ability to be in self helps their protective parts relax so their selves can flow in. So in IFS, we do find when our parts step back, there is a beautiful energetic, presence that we can hold. And plus we're sending all the cues of safety through our facial expression and tone of voice and all of this. So people just being in our presence when we've got some self on board helps shift their nervous systems toward regulation. And Deb Dana says something really similar, this is all supported, what Dick's saying is supported by polyvagal theory. She says when her clients are not yet in the place where they've got sufficient ventral activity active in their systems to help regulate their adaptive survival states, then she will lend her own ventral to the interaction. Her being anchored in ventral lets her then send cues of safety through her facial expression and her tone of voice and her gestures and all of this and her pacing. And then that allows their nervous systems to start to step toward regulation. So she said something, I heard her say something once, and it's not just her, I've heard similar quotes from other people, but she said the safety is the treatment. Whenever we're bringing safety to an interaction, we are helping retune the nervous system. So I try to remember that, if maybe I don't get all the way to an unburdening in one session with a client, or maybe we only are just starting the process of building a relationship with a protector. And remembering, as long as I'm doing that, I'm bringing self, I'm bringing some safety, I'm helping them at whatever stage they're at, see if they can access a little bit of their own self energy, or if not, I'm doing direct access to lend mine to their system more directly, then that is part of the treatment for them. That's part of retuning the nervous system. I don't have to unburden every session. And I think I mentioned this maybe in the webinar before this course, that in 2014, there was an empirical study done by Geller and Steve Porges based on polyvagal theory that really supported this idea. It showed that if a therapist goes into a therapy session in a regulated state themselves, that it draws their clients' nervous systems toward regulation automatically, no matter what techniques they're using or interventions. So what Dick has been saying forever before we knew about polyvagal theory, self begets self, it's so important. It may sound basic, but it's important for us to remind ourselves of this a lot. It's almost everything sometimes in a given interaction. So this is a picture of me and my daughter. It was taken about 7 years ago. She was 8 years old. And she was really dysregulated, as you can see. She was both angry and sad at the same time. So it was a meltdown, as they say. And as you see, in that moment, I'm co-regulating with her. I'm also looking at my husband like, why are you taking a picture of this? But I'm actually grateful that he took a picture of it, because it's very rare that you have a picture of co-regulation during a tantrum, because it's just an odd thing to have. But the point of me showing you this is just to illustrate that concept, self begets self. When one person has access to, I probably only had access to a critical mass of self. I don't look entirely self, radiant self in this picture. I can see there was some stress happening in my system, probably because the noise, the screaming, the whatever she was doing, somewhat was moving my system out of regulation. Parts of me were probably right there at the surface, maybe protectors, who knows what, can't remember that day. So I see it in my face though. It's not entirely, I'm not entirely in self the way I know what my face looks like when I've got more access to self. However, I had enough that she could use the regulation of my body, my touch, enough of my self energy to help her calm. And 2 years after the picture was taken, she was 10, she was in 5th grade. They had to write a story or a poem, the kids did, about their hero, which is a common assignment for kids. And she wrote the poem. She happened to write about me. And so it was touching for me to see how she saw me, but more so her insights into polyvagal theory that I didn't even know at the time. So she wrote, "Life can be troubling and sometimes unfair, but when I get too stressed, you always are there. When I'm stuck on a problem, needing answers to questions, you come to help out and offer suggestions. Your heart and soul are always there, while mine are sometimes hard to find. You help me through the depths of despair and turn my spirit back to kind. When I'm lost and stuck alone, you search for my heart to take me home. You lift my spirits through the dark and the blue, giving me the power to send love back to you." So for me, the last 3 stanzas of that poem are essentially pointing to how she could feel the presence of my self energy, however much I had available, when she would get very blended with parts in survival states. And that's what she's meaning, I think, by her heart and soul were hard to find in those moments, meaning herself. She didn't have access to herself. And she talks about turning her spirit back to kind. I interpret that as, when the parts unblend and then self becomes internally available again. So there's also mention of what I think is the dorsal state. When I'm lost and stuck alone, you search for my heart to take me home. So self, we think of as home, and helping her find her way back to self with no fancy therapeutic techniques, just with the co-regulation, just with the self energy, the presence for her. It allowed her to access herself again. And where she says, giving me the power to send love back to you, that's what happens when somebody is able to connect with their self energy and experience some ventral activity again. Then they're available for connection with others. And that includes their ability to both receive and send, loving energy, cues of safety, of connection, invite people into connection with them. So she had this insight into that she couldn't even be loving with me when she was in a very blended place. But when she came back home, essentially, she was grounded in self, in regulation again, then she could be her loving self. She could find her heart and soul again. So I keep this poem around. It's actually on my desk in my office. I return to it really often when I'm thinking about polyvagal informed IFS, because it reminds me when clients are lost and stuck alone in survival states, and I want them to be able to connect with the parts of them that are in those states, I have to lend my self energy to the situation to make it more possible for them to find their way back home. And this is my son co-regulating with one of our cats. Tamino, this is the cat you saw at the beginning, but here he's a kitten, so he was a little lighter. But I included this picture for a specific reason, which is that for many of our clients, and even for some of us, sometimes the safest being to co-regulate with is not a person, but a beloved pet. Pets can be really safe, really reliable, really uncomplicated sources of co-regulation compared to humans sometimes. So for some of my clients, pets were the only ones available to co-regulate with. Throughout their childhoods, they were life-saving for them. So I just wanted to honor that here. But talking about co-regulation in IFS therapy, specifically the co-regulation that occurs between the therapist and the client, polyvagal theory tells us when we're in any interaction with another person, our nervous systems are having a conversation. You know, below the surface, they're communicating with each other. They're influencing the state of each other. And that's what we've been saying, that the regulated presence of the therapist can draw the client's system towards regulation. And what's nice about that is that that movement happens under the surface in addition to whatever techniques that we're using. So if we're aware of that, it's like we get this extra help with making our therapy effective. It's not, I have to learn more, I have to know more, I have to have more techniques. You know, if we're doing our own work to bring as much self as we can to the interaction, we're helping shift them into a place where they're going to do their own healing work. I mean, their self is the agent of healing after all. So if our being in self helps them access self, they're going to do a lot of the work for us. So in IFS terms, we want to lend our self energy to the space between us, to allow our clients' parts to pick up on it, which then, as Dick says, allows their protectors to relax a bit so that some of their self can be there. And sometimes we know they can't do this. You know, sometimes their protectors aren't ready to soften back and to allow access to any of their own self energy yet. And as we may know, that's in IFS when we use direct access. So instead of telling our clients then to go inside and unblend from and connect and communicate directly with their parts, we are interacting directly with the client while they are blended with whatever part of them is very active. So we're holding self-energy so that the part that's blended with them can feel that regulating influence from us, and they can share whatever they need to with us. They can be validated, and they can be held in self-energy from the outside because they can't yet get that from the inside. And that is co-regulation for that part. And I think about that a lot, that these parts that are in extreme roles that carry maybe a lot of hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused energy, maybe they have never been welcomed by anybody truly. Maybe they've never had the chance to be fully heard and appreciated and considered and seen and acknowledged. Now they're blended with the client and they're being received and held by us. So they're now getting to finally show up as they are and share their feelings and share their story and even share their energy with a regulated other who's compassionately attending to them. And as you do that for them, as you hold that space for them to be as they are with you, they start to feel a little bit closer to their own regulated state because they're being heard, they're being respected, not because we're telling them to calm down or to not feel this way, but because they are actually being respected and listened to and attended to as they deserve to be. And as they start to calm the part that's blended, maybe in that session itself, it might be possible then for them to unblend just enough that we can turn the baton over to the client's self. And then the part gets to experience co-regulation, both from us on the outside and from the client on the inside. And maybe it's not going to be in that session. Maybe it'll take a few sessions, or for some systems, much longer. But we're giving them that external co-regulation. And eventually the hope is they can also get it internally. So this regulated presence of the therapist or the practitioner that shows up consistently week after week, year after year in some cases, that allows the client to exercise those neural circuits of connection that maybe either never got the chance to be exercised in the first place or that got retuned by traumatic experience, and now they need help getting back into shape. So in the moment, like moment-to-moment interactions we're having with our clients, our self-led regulated presence is making our therapeutic work safer, makes very deep work possible, because eventually it helps the clients access enough of their self so that they can be present with their protective parts, with their traumatized parts, with their parts that are in these survival states or using these states. Because if they can be present with the parts, rather than getting flooded and overtaken by their energy and getting pulled into the survival states, then they can do the healing work. So short term, moment to moment, our regulated presence makes the work possible, draws their system into regulation. The work is easier and less effortful. And the long-term benefit is that as the client repeatedly exercises those circuits of connection externally with you, and then practices exercising them internally with self-to-part connections, that helps shift their nervous system toward a place where it can self-regulate effectively, which is what a flexible and resilient nervous system can do, you know. So we will pause for a second here. I'm going to take a look in the chat before we go to our video and see. We have some questions. Okay. Yeah. So it reminds me of IFS talks where Pam Krause mentions the spiritual bypassing that can happen with self. Yeah, there's some great episodes on IFS talks, but Pam Krause does a wonderful one about self. Nicola, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I love that poem, by the way, by your daughter. It's so gorgeous. Thanks. I'm thinking about you saying about if children don't get co-regulation, they don't learn self-regulation, and they have to find ways to soothe. So would that be things like sucking their thumb? I know a little girl that used to do a lot of, she'd sniff her arm and just like touch her arm. They're trying to regulate their systems, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking it really explains addiction, doesn't it? Because addiction is about soothing, or any firefighter is a soother. So
Yes.
in a way, it just seems a little bit different when we think of it as they're trying to regulate their systems.
Yes.
And I know Deb Dana will do, won't she? She'll do a lot with the ladder and how do we get back? Would you ever introduce that alongside IFS was one of my questions. And the other one was Gabor Mate, when he talks about addiction, he always says, what's the pain? Because addiction is managing pain. So are we really saying the pain is that lack of attunement, the lack of self-regulation? Or can pain create, because it seems to me as if we're talking here about attachment and relational traumas, aren't we? And they've never had the attachment and the secure attachment to get. So they're just some thoughts. I don't know if those questions make sense, but
yeah, no, I'll try to speak to a few. There's so much in there.
That's
really,
a thought. Yeah, thanks.
that I could say. When you're talking, yes, I really appreciate what you're saying. What Gabor Mate says about when you're looking at addiction, it's not what's the addiction, all that. It's what's the pain underneath that. But also when you're talking about these various forms of behaviors that we can do that are regulating, they talk about how ingestive behaviors, eating, for example, we're thinking about people who talk about struggling with what they might call food addiction, however they call it, or binge eating or whatever. That's going to stimulate ventral for them. So taking things in, or sucking or other things like that. So it is like attempts sometimes for us to self-regulate and activate some of these pathways if that helps. So I like that idea, what you're saying, of like looking at these things through the lens of self-regulation instead of a pathologizing critical view of these ways that we might have had to try to regulate if we didn't have the way that our systems would have optimally loved to get it, which is through co-regulation, having somebody else's, regulated nervous system and social engagement system sending cues to us and, holding us in that energy so that we can give it back. I know you said a lot.
Well, I was thinking it does make it seem simpler to me to work with a client around regulation than what's the pain. Helping them to learn regulation, like, you're using this part. I mean, I know it's not pure IFS, but helping them make the connection that is the regulation they're trying to get with their addictive or the overeating, or, it seems a little bit easier to start there than try to find the pain.
And we do have the option, and I might talk about more of that in the 4th session of the workshop. We do have the option of blending these things a little bit more explicitly, right, where we can be using certain strategies to help with regulation, but being very, very cautious to do that in a non-exiling way that will still allow us to eventually go there and be there with the parts that are holding the pain so that we can help them release it in the unburdening. But sometimes they can't do that without at least some more ability to regulate. And so sometimes we might need to, like you're saying, maybe bring in other things that help with the regulation. And if we can, I mean, my bias, if I can, is always to do that through IFS, but there are times that other things can help too, in addition. We'll talk about that more in the fourth segment though.
Lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So at the moment, Sam was just saying, maybe we need to understand the pain or burden of a part first so that we can then help them self-regulate. And in a way, that would be a lot of the IFS theory, like the protectors really can't step down from these extreme roles where they're using all these other forms to try to help us regulate until the exile underneath is healed. So if we can do it that way, because that's my bias, that's my default, I'll always try to see if we can get permission from these protectors. And Dick will say, yeah, we're getting to know these protectors in their extreme role, but then when we go in and we help with the healing, then they can step down. But I've also seen it sometimes where we also need to help them with the regulation in order to be able to do some of that deeper work. And if you do happen to go and listen to any of the podcast episodes I was telling you about, the one that I did recently, Anibal and I did recently with Joanne Twombly, does speak to some systems that are very, very chronically and very severely dysregulated, systems that have experienced very severe trauma, and where it might be necessary to sort of help in some other ways in addition to kind of the pure IFS. And so that's why in the fourth session, I'll talk about, if we got to do that, how can we make sure to make it IFS consistent and honoring and non-exiling, and with the goal of eventually bringing connection with these parts and helping. So I have to move into sharing our video, or we won't get to it, but I want to come back to, we'll come back to questions. So let's see. Oh, I realized before I do that, I actually need to show you, sorry, I need to show you one more slide to explain what you're going to see. Okay. So we're going to move into seeing the first segment of the first video. I have 2 clients to share with you. This is the first one. And it's kind of a different type of a session than you might have seen in other IFS workshops, whether it's mine or other people's, because a lot of times in IFS workshops, we show videos where a full healing process takes place. All the videos you see with Dick Schwartz usually involve him working with one or more protectors that eventually soften back. There's the exile, and he'll do the healing work. But this session is a little bit different, and I wanted to show it for several reasons. I think one is that it might be a bit more representative of what happens in a lot of our sessions, where we might not get to do the full healing process in one 50-minute session, or in this case, 45-minute session. So sometimes we are working to establish some relationships with protectors who are in extreme roles. Maybe we're doing a bit of relationship establishment with an exile. Sometimes we're laying the foundations for our future work. So this session does include all of that, but I also chose it because it demonstrates what I think of as the seamless method of integrating IFS and polyvagal theory, where the polyvagal theory is underlying and supporting and informing the work, but where we're using only pure IFS techniques to work in concert with the nervous system. So like I said, later on, maybe in our fourth session, we can talk more about the fact that, of course, we can more explicitly blend the models. We can talk nervous system, we can psychoeducate, we can include other things. But you can do that in a lot of models. So what I wanted to show you more of is, what if we just use IFS? How can we do that in a polyvagal informed way? How is IFS just naturally doing that in a polyvagal informed way as well? So in this session, I'll be working with parts that are associated with both the sympathetic and dorsal survival states. Today, we're going to start with one of the sympathetic, associated part. We won't see the dorsal one today. But the aim is to see, can we try to help the client access a bit of self-energy so that he can connect with this very sympathetically charged part who's associated with the fight state of fight or flight? Can he connect at all with that part from self? Because establishing the self to part relationship will lay the foundation for the deeper healing that will eventually release the protector from that extreme role. And to give you some background on him, he is a cisgender heterosexual white male, and he's in his mid-50s. He's a very highly educated professional. He's got these degrees from different very respected universities around the world. He's worked at multiple high-profile companies in maybe 25 plus years of work experience. So I had worked with him for about 2 to 3 years before the pandemic. But right when the pandemic hit, he lost his job, and eventually all his money went, because he was out of work for quite a while. So he had no money, no insurance, nothing to pay for therapy, and barely enough to pay for housing, and eventually barely enough to pay for food. So that's the situation you'll see him in this video, where he's, really at rock bottom in that way. Sometimes not eating 2 or 3 days at a time, all of that. So when he lost his job, I'd offered to see him for free for a period of time. I said, you paid me like 2.5 years. Why don't we, until you get on your feet and you get a job that pays enough, why don't we just do this for free? And he couldn't do it. He said that would basically cause way too much distress in his system. It would activate all kinds of critical parts. He didn't want to do the sessions we could have done to work with those parts. He's like, no, it's not good for me. I can't do this for free. So he basically didn't have a session for 2.5 years. And during that time, during the pandemic, he was completely isolated. He's single. He has never been partnered. He has no children. His sisters live thousands of miles away. He has pre-existing health conditions, so he didn't even venture out of his apartment almost at all for the first 2 years of the pandemic. So his neural circuits of connection basically atrophied. He had a lack of social interaction, a lack of opportunity to engage those neural circuits of connection, and his social engagement system was not exercised. So his nervous system, because of that and because of all the circumstances in his life, it entered this chronic state of threat. So basically he was alternating between being in sympathetic survival, very much fight, sometimes fight, and dorsal survival, like a shutdown, and hopelessness and all of this. And he had almost no glimpses of self. He was just alternating between these survival states, and his financial situation deteriorated. He ended up having to leave his apartment. He was just getting rooms in people's Airbnb, just single rooms, trying to find a job that would pay him enough to get into an apartment. His alcohol use had gotten bad. He was drinking fairly heavily almost every night. So a few months ago, things just reached an all-time low for him. So he had no money or savings. His job was paying him about $13 an hour. It wasn't enough to get through the month. So he started having some passive suicidal ideation, and also the presence of a very sympathetically charged angry part that was coming out a bit, and he was really worried would really come out and land him in jail or seriously wounded. So he actually contacted me for an emergency session, and the only condition under which he was willing to have a free session would be if I used it to teach other people. So that's why we have this session. It's a kind of a gift from him. So I'll play the first clip for you, and I'm thinking, because it's our break time, I'm thinking that I should let us do our break, and then we'll come back and we'll watch the clip and process it after the break. So if we can break now for 15 minutes and then come back, and we'll get into our first video clip. Okay. So I think we might have about a minute left. I just wanted to let you all know that I have been answering your questions in the chat, just in the interest of time, because we're a tiny bit behind in the schedule, and I want to make sure to get through everything. So the questions should be answered there, and feel free to keep submitting questions as you have them, and I will get to them either live or in the chat as we move through the rest of today. So let me go ahead and share with you now the first segment of our video, and I did put captions on there to help, because sometimes it can be a little hard to understand, so hopefully that will be useful. Hi.
Hello, good morning. How are you doing?
Good. I know you haven't been able to come in and have an official session since the pandemic, so it's probably been about 2 years since you've been able to have.
At least 2 years, yes. Although we
Yeah.
spoke, which was one of the reasons I sent you that text. I really was feeling it, and I didn't mean to kind of push you into having a meeting, but I really felt like I needed some kind of an intervention.
Absolutely. No, I understand. You said you're really worried about your mental health. So if you could tell me like what's going on.
How long do you have?
We have time. We have time. Don't worry.
As I said in the movie, can you handle the truth? So basically, I feel like everything is just imploding around me. Everything from work, finances, health, just life, you know, and just really want to do something dramatic. I don't know what, you know. And I really wish there was an off switch for my life. I really do not want. I'm not saying I want to kill myself, but I wish I wasn't existing. So I'm really just not seeing the point of it. You know, it's almost like a very long, dark, windy tunnel. And you just cannot see where it ends or how long more of the bullshit, you have to go through.
Yeah.
Because it seems like each time one of these things happens in my life, Lexi, as you know, I end up one step lower, you know.
I know.
And
You have
now,
been
although
through so much.
yes, and now although this job is providing, sorry, I didn't sleep last night, some level of income, it's just pretty mind-blowing not being able to use 25 years of experience and over 200 grand of education. That is a big trigger. So just things have been just really, and then as we said, that the fact that I've got to now go and find a room in somebody's house, you know, for Airbnb, and the car's beat up. I have to put stuff back in storage again. So it's almost like the same thing. And I've kind of had enough. You know that boxing analogy I've been using with you? Now I just don't want to get up again.
Right.
You know, it feels like I've taken another punch with multiple opponents in the ring. And now I'm just saying, excuse me, my language, I'm just saying, fuck it. What's the point? If I know I'm going to end up back on the floor, what's the point? So it's been really, really, really horrible, tough few months. And yeah, so and then also again, everything, just nothing seems to be, I mean, far from what I had planned. But even just generally, everything just again seems to be going wrong. I know this is probably a parts thing, but I just despise living here, both in my apartment building and both in Atlanta and both in Georgia and maybe even in the US. Some part of me wants to go back home. So I think those are exaggerated feelings because of the parts, but I'm so blended I can't differentiate anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that if I come home from work or come home, the first thing I do is draw the curtains, trying to keep Atlanta out.
Right.
And I just sit there and put my headphones on. So that's going to become my life, either at work or here with my headsets on and the lights off.
Yeah.
It's been really, and I know it's not healthy, but it's the only healthy coping mechanism I have.
No, it's been helping you. It's been helping you to kind of close out the world and the.
Yes, the semi-dark with a cup of tea and a packet of cookies. And not a packet, 2 or 3 cookies instead of a bottle of wine. So it's just been very stressful. Again, I don't know if stress is a powerful enough word, but sometimes I just want to get in my car and just drive somewhere and just forget it, you know.
Okay,
Of course, as we know, we can't get away from what's inside. And that's and sometimes I wish I didn't know as much about this stuff. So sometimes I wish I was just really dumb and stupid. But you know, I'm not too bright, but I'm not too stupid either. So
well, so I know though that you were concerned because you were just noticing having more thoughts of just wanting to have an off switch to your life. A lot of despair.
That yes, maybe just for stress relief, or just saying truly kind of what's the point? You know, because again, you try hard and then you still have the same BS. Like I said to you before, I just paid off the debt of breaking the Washington apartment, what now, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
And I still have debts that I incurred after the Cox dismissal. So you think, so I just basically stopped paying and everything. So to hell with you, I'm earning $12 an hour. I can't pay anything if you want to take it to jail.
Yeah.
But the machine continues, though. The machine continues.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you want, we can see like where it would be helpful to start in terms of a part or parts to work with today. So if you just take a moment and go inside and just,
I can't even put my hand on my chest. I'm so upset.
okay, so what are you noticing right now?
You remember the Incredible Hulk?
Yeah.
Just that kind of person, just even almost worse than Arnie. That Incredible Hulk, just as he's about to burst out and just get angry, it's just that rage. Just and I've just been suppressing it with a corkscrew, and it just keeps coming out, and I keep pushing it in.
Yeah.
And last night I almost blew up at work. So twice I've had a blow up at work, telling somebody to fuck off and walking out on them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the most terrifying thing is the Hulk just coming out. So the Hulk is even more scary than Arnie, because Arnie is protective. The Hulk is offensive. There's a big difference.
Okay. And that's what you're feeling now inside.
Yes,
you're in touch with that
Arnie,
rage.
Yes, and Arnie is never angry. He's protective and caring, but he does kick ass. Hulk is just a madman. I mean, just and as I said before, when I'm in that rage, I don't see gender, I don't see color, I don't see height, size, age. That's the sort.
So you could go after someone that could hurt you and other
I mean, a policeman easily, especially authority figure.
Okay.
Especially as we said before, maybe minority figures too. But
okay.
So I literally dread going out. So when I have to go to work at 10:30. Just the thought of driving that 2 miles, I get nervous right now. Not because of traffic,
but because you can feel the Hulk there just ready to come out. Okay, so go ahead and go inside and notice. Let me know, where are you noticing that rage?
Right here, just eyes and temple. And upper chest, not so much in my heart, right up here, kind of where I get my infections. Right, this is where I get my infections, right here, and then this area here.
Okay, so you feel, the rageful energy. What else do you notice?
Just wants to burn it all down, just angry and destructive.
Yeah.
Just use a kind of an old adage, just wants to go postal, but not for the record. You know?
Okay.
It's just, just so angry at life. And the Hulk wants somebody to blame, just at least because it would help. I mean, I'm happy to blame myself. It's just not being able to, like I said before, not being able to identify one specific root cause, person, place, time. It's more infuriating.
Sure. Okay.
If you said to me, it's your dad's fault, I'll say, okay, that's fine. I'll live with that. But it's not knowing. And of course, you know, my background, there probably isn't a specific juncture or time. It's accumulation.
Yeah.
I think that, so even now talking, I'm getting short of breath.
Okay. Yeah. So let's stay inside there. You're noticing the rage. The Hulk is really active, and just see, how are you feeling toward him right now?
I'm just going to kind of recap for you the things to look for. So obviously this session started with direct access. It's how most therapy sessions start. So the client came in and he was just speaking directly to me as the therapist. So there's at least some blending from a part, in this case, a part that's concerned about all that's been going on recently and that's reporting about it. So in this case, there's a pretty overwhelmed part of this client that's telling me what's been going on recently, telling me why he asked for the session. And while that part is out front and listing its concerns, the client's looking at me and co-regulating with me externally. So he'll be kind of thinking, and then he'll look at me and he's telling me directly. So we do that for a good 5 minutes, which it feels long now when I go back and look at the session. But given the fact that he was isolated for 2 years and we didn't have sessions for 2.5 years, it was his way, protector's way too, of reconnecting with me. And you can see at first, as I'm trying to get him to go inside, he's popping out, popping out, popping out. He needed some minutes of external co-regulation before we could hope to have him inside for any sort of sustained amount of time. So he needed to feel just the influence of some self-energy from someone else, and the parts just listing all the struggles he's been facing. And then trying to shift him toward insight, trying to shift him toward finding a target part to work with. So the first thing he noticed when he tried to focus internally is that he's so upset, he can't even put his hand on his chest. So he's having physiological symptoms that are associated with the sympathetic survival state: tension, pain, agitation. He also had mentioned other evidence that he exists a lot of the time in a sympathetic survival state. He has sensory sensitivities. Now he has to come home, draw the blinds, turn down the lights, put on noise canceling headphones. He's got to keep the lights, the sounds, all the stimulation of Atlanta, of the world out. So in a state of sympathetic survival, we're more sensitive to all of those stimuli. So it makes sense that he's been needing to do that if he's spending a lot of time in that threat state. So I have him go back and just focus on what he's experiencing physiologically and describe it to me. So kind of the find and focus steps. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One, it's a way to zero in on a possible target part. As he's finding and focusing on what he's experiencing, it helps him come into awareness of the parts, and specifically this part that is most active in him at the moment. But also the second reason is having him focus on what he's experiencing and describe it to me is functioning as a little bit of an unblending tool, So in order for him to be able to form a self to part relationship with whatever part he's going to identify, he's going to need to not be completely in the survival state, because he can't do anything in the state. He's popping out and talking to me, and we're trying to take him in. He's popping out and talking to me again. So these steps, these initial steps of the 6 Fs are slowing him down a little bit, not trying to get away from the part, actually trying to turn toward the part that's activated. So for some clients, if you do IFS, once we take those clients inside, they're able to just stay focused internally for the remainder of the session. We go to this entirely insight-focused experience. But what you saw here is actually something that's common for clients who are experiencing a lot of sympathetic activation, or they're in sympathetic survival, which is that they'll try to go inside and they might be inside for a couple of seconds, but then they pop out and look at you and they're talking to you directly again. And you'll see this for this client throughout the session, but we start getting progressively longer periods of insight and deeper connection with parts, and slowing down and much more stretches of time inside with self to part work as the session progresses. So he's popping out, he's co-regulating with me, a part that wants to narrate or wants to tell a story, wants to tell an anecdote, might blend. And I might let it happen for several seconds, maybe even a minute or two, and then we refocus him back inside. And then we get a longer stretch. So some of you may be wondering, as you were seeing him popping out here, you might have already wondered, why do you let him pop out like that? Why don't you immediately have him focus back inside? Because in some sessions with some clients, I would actually do that. I would have them refocus fairly quickly. I'd pause them and have them refocus and notice and go back inside fairly quickly. One reason I didn't do that with him is because of his unique circumstances. So we're looking at context too for people. So this man was completely isolated for over 2 years. He's had not only no social interaction at all, but none with anyone who even knows him at all, who cares about him. So from a polyvagal perspective, that co-regulation with another human is incredibly important. So actually being okay with him popping out a little, looking in my eyes, speaking to me directly, seeing the caring that I have for him, coming at him, has some therapeutic value, and it is a bit regulating for him and gives us some hope that we're going to be able to then go in and do some insight. But it's still IFS, it's direct access. So I'm just holding the part that's talking to me and that's so agitated, holding it in my self energy. So I'm not rushing him back inside to refocus. Also, another reason why sometimes we let these parts come out and do their thing instead of constantly trying to immediately get back in is sometimes when a part blends like that during a session, it could be a narrator part or a thinking part, an analyzing part, an I don't know part, it's because the client's autonomic nervous system has picked up on a cue of danger somewhere. Could be internally, whatever's going on with their body or with their parts. It could be externally. And their body has started to shift a bit into a survival state. And because the parts are wired into the nervous system, a protector might come out, take over, maybe pop them out of internal connection, have them looking outside, looking at us, telling a story, whatever they're doing, as an attempt to move them back into some regulation. You know, so let's say in his case, as he's going in, let's say the system is starting to feel the energy of the Hulk, that rage that he's talking about, ready to just burst out of his body. You know, that rising rage internally can be sensed as a cue of danger. So a protector could come out, could come online and start narrating, because that can bring some regulation to the system. So one of the things I like about IFS is we can work with that. We can work in concert with the nervous system instead of fighting against it and trying to force our techniques on the person in the moment because we think it would be better to go back inside, you know. So in the case of this client, when he pops out like that, we do spend a few seconds, sometimes minutes, you know, minute or so, allowing the protector to do his thing, get a little co-regulation, and then we refocus and we go right back inside. And eventually we get where we're going. So you also heard him mention Arnie several times in this segment, and he might again, so I'll tell you, Arnie is short for Arnold Schwarzenegger, who played the Terminator. That's why this picture is up there. It's another protector that we had worked with in his system in the past who had stepped down from his extreme role after we healed some of the exiles he was protecting. So the system now views Arnie as a very safe and sane and strategic presence in the system. Able to bring protection if needed, but having so much choice, so much discernment about when to deploy his methods. So they respect Arnie, they're not scared of him. Arnie hasn't had to be extreme ever since we did the healing of the exiles, so there's a lot of trust in Arnie. So the part that's out front that's talking to me is kind of contrasting Arnie with the Hulk, because the Hulk is in an extreme role, comes out reactively without apparent strategy, without apparent discernment. So the system's pretty scared of him. So I will take a minute here to see if there are questions about that segment. Let me look in the chat. Yeah. Can you elaborate on what you do as a therapist to co-regulate? How much is verbal? How much is nonverbal? Such a good question. Are there certain energies you strive to access, and might the kind of energy vary based on the client's presentation? Might it work better to search for compassion with one client, but clarity for another? Oh, such a great question. Okay. So much of what I'm doing in co-regulation is nonverbal. Not all of it, but so much of it is nonverbal. So you notice even in that whole first 5 minutes, he's going on about stuff, you know, and I'm sitting with him, I'm looking at him, I'm allowing my parts to step back so that I'm not, you know, crying in the face of this, you know, parts of me are heartbroken for this precious man. I really care about him, and he's been in such an awful situation, but me breaking down is not helpful. You know? So I'm asking parts of me to step back so that what I'm holding is more of that, you know, self energy, that compassion. So he can see me, you know, looking at him, engaged with him. Clearly there's caring coming from my eyes. There's a softness, there's a gentleness there. My tone of voice may be, you know, soft, depending. But your question is so good in terms of might the kind of energy vary based on the client's presentation? And that, I think that's absolutely true, because for this client, number one, I know him, and I also will shift based on what part he's blended with a little bit, but I know that his system responds best to being held with a lot of compassion, a lot of gentleness, a lot of tenderness. And that if I do that in the face of rage parts, in the face of anything, he starts to drop down towards self with me barely having to do anything, barely having to say much, no matter how dysregulated he is. And you can see he's pretty dysregulated here. I can't get a word in edgewise. I might try to say something, he'll talk over me, which is what happens with sympathetic. But if I keep holding that presence very steadily and conveying with my nonverbals, I'm here with you, listening to you, I care about you, he starts to slow down. But I'll talk hopefully at the end of today, if I can get to it, and then in next week's session about maybe some different qualities of self or different types of energy we might want to bring with different types of parts. So the rest of your question will get addressed in some more detail. And yeah, Colin, it's a really good question too, is using nonverbal as effective when using Zoom? And I imagine, of course, you'd have to ask each individual person that, but from what I've seen from my clientele that I've done with Zoom now for several years, is it's been incredibly effective, the nonverbal. And I was worried about that because I felt like, that there was something that happened in the energy in the physical space, which there may be something over and above what's happening on Zoom that happens in the physical space. But it's remarkable how much people can pick up on the nonverbals, on the tone of voice, the eyes, the facial expression, the little vocal bursts, okay, oh, whatever that we make spontaneously when we're in a compassionate place. And their system responds to that. So they can see it, and they have a lot, in some ways, of control, some more control over things, not one nonverbal element, which is proximity, like distance to the person. They can place me at whatever distance feels safe and okay to them, and they can use earbuds so I'm close to their ear if they want to or not, but they can place my, face as close or far from them. And some of them say it's been better because for whatever reason, my eyes are very expressive in terms of, my energy. And some of them like to be way up close to them and can get really close on Zoom, a foot away. And in my office, we're 5-6 feet away and they can't come sit a foot from me. We can sit a little closer. We can move our chairs a bit, but a foot from each other might not feel terribly comfortable to either of our parts, depending on the person. So they get control over that proximity too with Zoom, which is interesting. So I'll look at more questions after, just because we have to move on a little at the moment. And before we see our second segment of the video with him, I want to briefly cover our next topic, which is something that I call internal co-regulation. Because we're going to see it in the video. So with the emphasis that IFS has on us forming self-to-part connection in the internal system, IFS offers us something extremely beautiful and powerful. And it's something that I've come to call internal co-regulation. And I've actually searched the scientific literature. I've not seen this term used before. It's possible I invented it. I don't know. Hope so. But anyway, internal co-regulation is just what it sounds like. Instead of co-regulation occurring between two separate people externally, like the client and me, it's occurring internally between the self of the client and whatever part they're working with. So co-regulation can happen between the self of a client and a protector, between the self and an exile. So like this picture might be the client being with a young exile, for example. So if we have a protector that's in an extreme role and might be either very sympathetically charged, like this Hulk is, or is bringing dorsal energy, which we will see examples of in our future sessions, or we have an exile that's stuck in sympathetic activation, maybe they're actively terrified, or they're in dorsal vagal collapse, whatever. Bringing that part into connection with self can be incredibly regulating for them. So self is associated with the ventral vagal state. So as the client accesses some self energy and directs it, extends it toward the part who is in a survival state, the part starts to feel that energy and be influenced by it, and be influenced by the regulation of self, the same way a dysregulated client can become more regulated when they're with a regulated therapist externally. So the client interacting from at least a critical mass of self with a wounded or protective part stuck in a survival state helps exercise the neural circuits of connection. So the client feels some curiosity toward the part, which is an emergent quality of ventral or of self, and then extends that. And then the part starts to feel a tiny bit calmer because of that and starts responding well to the client. That increases the access to self. And then the client directs more of that self energy to the part. So it's this positive feedback loop. And every time we do this, every time we take a client inside to connect in this co-regulating way with a part of them, we're exercising the circuits of connection. We're working on healing the nervous system. So that's why I often say to consultees, don't worry so much about what particular part you're working with on any given day. Because sometimes they say, oh, we only got to work with protectors. We didn't get to heal any exiles today. In some ways it matters, of course, that we eventually get to the exiles and all that. But in some ways it doesn't, because exercising the circuits of connection with any part so that more self or more ventral is brought to the system and the circuits become more finely tuned, it's going to be helpful in the person's nervous system. So this internal co-regulation, this interacting internally with dysregulated parts from a regulated place, is an incredibly effective self-regulation skill. And when clients are out in the world between sessions and they start to get dysregulated, you know, maybe an exile or a protector stuck in a survival state starts to blend, then their ability to recognize, oh, this is part of me blending. Let me turn my attention toward it. Start, you know, connecting with it, letting it know I'm here. You know, that is co-regulating with the part internally, and it can shift their physiological state in the moment. And it opens up the possibility and the opportunity for healing, because, you know, these parts are coming into connection with self internally. The protectors are. They're starting to feel better in its presence because of the co-regulation. So they start to trust, well, maybe this could be good for the exiles I'm protecting. Maybe I can let them come into presence with self. And there's so many benefits of internal co-regulation. One of the best is that we don't have to rely on external people to do it. It's, of course, it's wonderful if we have a partner, if we have a friend, if we have a therapist, colleague, whatever, that can co-regulate with us. That's wonderful. You know, if they can give us their full attention and hold space for us really beautifully, that's so amazing. But how often do we really get that, even if we're really fortunate and we have people there for us in our lives that really care about us and are capable of showing up like that? We don't get that every time we're upset. You know, they have their own lives. They've got their own systems, their own dysregulation, their own parts, you know. So once we get the hang of this process of noticing when we're getting blended and turning toward our parts, then we have a method of co-regulation and exercising the circuits of connection that is available all the time. And another lovely fact is that we don't have to achieve complete regulation in order to then have this be effective. As Deb Dana would say, if you just get a toehold in ventral, or Dick would say, if you get a critical mass of self, if you get even a tiny bit of curiosity toward whoever's blending with you, and you can direct it, you know, that brings regulation to the body. Just a little bit of access to self is a little bit of access to ventral. So it starts to down-regulate the protective systems. And internal co-regulation reinforces self as the natural leader of the system. If we're always looking outward for others to regulate us, then we're in a pretty vulnerable position. You know, we don't need to be ashamed if we look externally for comfort and regulation. That's part of how we're wired biologically, to be interdependent, you know, with others of our species. It's just that they're not always available, or not always willing, or not always able to help us. So we could end up in a lot of discomfort if all we know how to do is rely on them. So, you know, Dick Schwartz had written a book many years ago for couples called You Are the One You've Been Waiting For. And one of the things I love about that book is he talks about when people enter into romantic relationships, instead of looking at their partner as the rescuer or someone to fix them or complete them, they need to become the primary attachment figure for their parts, or what I would call the primary source of co-regulation. Then the partner can serve as a secondary source, you know? So we don't need to be totally self-reliant, and, you know, there's tons of value in co-regulating with others as much as we can get it. It's just the self becomes the primary attachment figure and is therefore available. And another wonderful thing about internal co-regulation is that it is a non-exiling form of self-regulation. So we'll talk more about this concept in the last week, but when we're co-regulating with a part internally, we're not sending it away so that we can feel more regulated. We're turning toward it, you know, in curiosity, maybe even in compassion and love, and being there for it so it can feel our care. And just like with any other human in the external world, parts in the internal world respond well to this, and they start to calm in a natural way, not because we're calming them down or suppressing, but because we're present for them and we're listening to them and we're giving them our energy and our attention. So we're going to watch this second segment of the video, and it will include internal co-regulation.
Yeah, so let's stay inside there. You're noticing the rage, the Hulk is really active, and just see how are you feeling toward him right now.
I'm kind of saying good because you're at least you're letting the energy out, or trying to. So again, I don't know if that's a part saying that.
Okay, you don't have to analyze. So, but you're noticing that there's probably a part of you that's happy that Hulk is there doing this.
But the bigger part is terrifying.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I would say 70, 80% absolute fear of the Hulk doing something crazy shit.
Okay.
And especially then, for example, the guy in the shop with the gun, and there's like 3 guys in the shop now I've seen with guns, and they've all been kind of African American. So if the Hulk just comes out, you could easily get shot, and down in this crazy south, it would be stand your ground in defense. Oh yeah, he was angry or shot his ass.
Okay.
So that's why the parts are worried about that. And of course, that then leads to other anger about how my whole neighborhood's changed. But mostly this as a system, I think I'm terrified of the Hulk.
Okay. Okay. So let's turn for a moment toward the part or the parts that are terrified that this Hulk could come out and either inflict harm on someone else or bring it harm on you. Yeah. So just let the parts that are terrified, let them know that you're hearing what they're saying. And you can appreciate why they're scared of Hulk taking over.
It's interesting, not only are they scared of the Hulk's action, but also his size. So again, these are 10-year-old boys. The parts were terrified. There's not a single adult part who's terrified.
Okay.
These are skinny little 10-year-old boys with skinny necks and shoulders.
Yes.
They're just terrified of that rage and the size of the Hulk.
Okay. Okay.
Because they know that unfortunately the guy just doesn't back down. And I'm not saying that in a macho way.
I understand. Yeah. When he's activated, he's blind to everything.
Just saying, I'm going to see this to the end.
Yeah. Okay.
It's really horrible because in that moment you have zero fear, Lex. Zero fear. But thank God sometimes the self jumps in. But for a few seconds you say, I don't give a fuck about jail, about getting punched. I don't give a F. And Arnie never does that. Only for protection. But this psychopath, I say, just goes all out.
Yeah. So stay with those 10-year-old boys for a moment. Just see how you're feeling toward them as you notice them scared there.
I want to cry for them. Because, they feel helpless. Not only do they grow up without the adult figure, here the adult figure is a psychopath.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you are feeling compassion for them. You're feeling.
For the small guys, 100%. I usually see them from the back because you can see the little boy, as you know, they've got a little shoulder and little neck. So I'm just seeing that and his short hair.
Yeah.
And I'm just.
Yeah. Okay. So see if there's a way for you to get them to notice that you're here and that you're feeling all this caring for them.
They've got sitting in a corner, kind of cross-legged with their head in the wall. That's how scared they are, like a little dog,
I understand. Yeah. Yeah. Really, just really gently approach them and let them feel that caring that you have for them.
That poor guy is shaking, like he's back.
Shaking. Is it more than one group of them or just one right now?
There were 2 or 3, now it's only one. I can see clearly. Just again, not the face, but just a shaking back and just a skinny little neck.
Yeah.
Again, my natural tendency is to put my hand on his shoulder and his neck.
Yeah. And how is he responding to that?
Yeah, his shoulders are melting down.
Good. Okay, so just stay there with him for a minute. Keep sending that caring through your touch, through your energy. You're good. You're good. You're doing great.
I'm just gonna put his head or side of his face on my arm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Still scared to look back, but he's leaning into me.
Good. Good. Stay with him.
He's so fragile and tiny, vulnerable, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
A little bit like an orphan almost.
Mhm. Yeah. Just be there for him however he needs.
I'm showing you a picture of cars.
Oh. Yeah, how's he responding?
Hmm?
How's he
Oh,
responding to that?
nice. He's kind of smiling and flicking the pages, and
Yeah,
it's funny that he knows the danger is still there, but he's not scared because I'm there with him.
absolutely.
A little bit like I mentioned you with my dad,
Yeah.
when I was under his arm, nothing could scare me.
So he's getting that with you right now. Good.
So I thought he was scared at me, the self, but he's scared at the Hulk's reactions.
Yes. Yes. And if he wants to tell you anything about that, he can. If it's enough that you just know that, that's fine too.
He's kind of worried now. He said, okay, now that I've calmed down, I don't want you to leave me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Let him know you're here for him. And also let him know that you're going to go do some work with Hulk right now. He can stay leaning on you if he wants to. He can wait somewhere safe if he wants to. But you know that he's scared of Hulk, so you're going to go try to help Hulk right now.
Suddenly, when you said that, some other parts were crazy. Like, do we even want to help that crazy son of a bitch?
Yeah, we'll talk to them too. But just stay with the little boy for a moment. See where he might want to wait while you, and you'll come back to him. But while you,
No, I'm telling you, he's happy trying to find my next car to buy.
okay. So he's happy sitting there with the car magazine.
Choosing,
Perfect.
choosing colors and everything. Very boyish, very boyish.
Yeah. Great. So if he's okay waiting there, let's check with the parts that are going crazy at the thought of us trying to turn toward the Hulk.
So at the beginning of this segment, the client had already identified a target part. He had found it in his body. He had focused on it. He had started to describe it. So we moved on then to the fourth F of the 6 Fs, which is asking, how do you feel toward this part? And as you may know, the purpose of that question is to detect, does the client have at least a critical mass of self-energy toward the target part? Because if he does, we can go befriend the target part. And if he doesn't, if he's too blended with other parts such that his self is totally obscured, then we'll have to unblend those other parts so that he can befriend the Hulk. Another reason that I was asking this, how do you feel toward question, is because sometimes we do need permission to work with a particular part. And we usually think about asking protectors permission before we go work with exiles. That's pretty standard. Of course, we need to do that, but there are some circumstances where we might even need permission from other parts before going to work with a protector. And what we saw in this session is one of those situations. There's a protector that a lot of other parts in the system are scared of. They might hate him, they might have shame about him, whatever it is. And in this case, there are parts that are scared of Hulk. So they could be present and they could be obscuring the client's ability to be in self with him, and that's going to prevent any good work from being done. So asking this question allows us to find out who's there, what might we need to do so that the client can actually come into a self-to-part connection with this protector. So since this is an integration workshop and not just an IFS workshop, we think about, well, why might we need to get this permission from a polyvagal perspective? So what polyvagal theory tells us is that in order to connect with someone else, we need some ventral vagal activity. Ventral is that state associated with safety, with social engagement and connection. So if the body's in a threatened state, we actually cannot effectively connect. So when we're asking in IFS how the client feels toward a part, we are in some ways gauging the state of the nervous system. If the client answers that question with the language of self, if they're saying, oh, I feel open, I feel curious, I feel tender, passionate, okay, then we understand you've got at least some ventral activation. You're in a place where your nervous system is saying it's okay to allow some connection. But if they answer in a way that indicates blending with one or more parts, that may even be in a survival state, then we know we have to do some unblending because they need the toe hold and regulation to even connect. And I just think all of that to me is important because sometimes when people learn IFS, they just follow the steps of the protocol and may not really have been given the understanding of why is a particular step actually important. So they may know, okay, I know I need to get a critical mass of self available before moving to befriend a part. I was told that, access some self, move toward a part. But sometimes it's not explained why. And I think this is a huge part of the why. We literally cannot connect with another person if our nervous system is not in the right place to do it. So the answer to this fourth F question really matters. So we have to do what it takes to get the person in a state that is biologically conducive to relationship building with whatever part. So when we're spending time with parts that are polarized with a target part, that are frightened of a target part, we're not just hearing them out and understanding their concerns. That's part of what we're doing. But it's not just about the content. Why are they worried about going to the Hulk? What are they afraid might happen if we go to the Hulk? It's not just about the content. It's more importantly about the regulation we're bringing to the nervous system by doing that. So we're trying to work in concert with the nervous system and not fight against it. So in this case, we found out that the client was blended with parts that were concerned about Hulk being dangerous and putting the client in a position where he could hurt somebody else, where he could get hurt himself. Then he was blended with young parts that were absolutely terrified of the Hulk, and neither of those states is conducive to feeling safe and being open to connection. And interestingly, although we didn't address this issue in this session, but it is on our agenda for a future session, it's something the client himself wants to do, you can hear some racist overtones in what he's saying when he speaks from a threatened place. So he has a job now at a retail store, and he's saying that, 3 of the men who were in his shop that were carrying guns recently happened to be all African American. And he mentions that, and then he alludes to how he's upset about how his neighborhood has changed recently. And that felt to me like he was suggesting something about race. And what's interesting is that's a parallel to what I was just talking about in the internal world. When our bodies have entered a threat state, and in this case, he's very sympathetically charged, it's not just that we're not open and available to connection with our internal parts, and we see them as dangerous, but the same applies to how we see the world and how we see people around us. So I only ever have heard racist overtones from this client when he's actively in a threatened state in his body. At other times, he has beautiful relationships with all kinds of people, different races, different ethnicities, everything. He can't say enough about how lovely they are. But when his body has entered a threatened state, suddenly people look dangerous to him, particularly people who don't look like him. So going back to the session first, he does some explaining about the nature of the Hulk, but he's not doing that through direct self-to-part connection with the Hulk. He doesn't have self available yet. He's just narrating what other parts' impressions are of the Hulk. So now we're hearing about a part, we're hearing about a person from other people. It's like kind of gossip, in the system. Other parts are talking about him, talking about how scary he is, how aggressive he is, how dangerous he is, what a threat his presence may pose. So he does this for a moment, and I direct him back inside to see, can we move toward a place of accessing self-energy toward these parts of him that are blended? Because if we can do that, that'll allow the parts to relax and allow him to actually connect directly with Hulk. So he starts reporting compassion for these young, scared parts. And originally it was a group that went down to one boy. And as soon as he says that he's feeling compassion for them, that's what Deb Dana would call a glimmer of ventral. We have a drop of self finally. He's been pretty blended this whole session. Then he sees this little skinny young 10-year-old boy, and he starts to feel compassion. So what Deb Dana says, polyvagal terms, and what we say in IFS, is when we see that drop of self, when we see that glimmer of ventral, our task is to try to expand it from a glimmer to a glow. So I'm allowing, I'm slowing down even further now that he has accessed some compassion. I'm allowing more empathy into my voice, encouraging him to stay with that boy and to deepen that connection and really extend that compassion to him. And he's co-regulating with him, through touch, through his presence. And the boy is coming into regulation, and he feels better. He doesn't feel scared anymore. And it's sad. We see this often with protectors, sometimes the very protection that they're trying to offer to keep the vulnerable parts safe is actually scaring the exiles, scaring the younger parts. So this young part was scared of this protector because the Hulk only knows how to protect through aggression. So we're seeing the process of internal co-regulation with this young part. Once a critical mass of self was established in the system, now we're going to turn back toward the target part. So it was established toward this young part, and he was in connection with this young part who's now happily reading the car magazines, but staying close because he wants to be close to self. And I decided to turn back and work with the Hulk, which is an interesting choice. So I did want to talk about it because there are, different ways people can go here. One way is to stay with the young part. Another way is to just ask the client, where does it feel right to go right now, to stay here with this young part or to go back to the Hulk? So you can offer all those choices. But I actually went back to the Hulk. I guided us back to the Hulk there. And one of the reasons for the decision, perhaps the main one, was I was hearing that the Hulk poses an immediate threat to the client and to the people around him. So when that happens, in my view, it's really important to form a relationship with that part. It's the same thing if we're faced with a suicidal part or other things. I don't have a hope if we've got a suicidal part that's very active or, this raging part that's very active, that in one session, I'm going to be able to do all the exile work underneath that would be necessary to release this part once and for all from this protective role. That's probably not going to happen, in the last 30 minutes of a session. So I know eventually I want to do that. I certainly want to go to the exiles underneath. That's how we got Arnold Schwarzenegger, out of his extreme role, is going to the exiles underneath. But in this session, I want to go back and form a self-to-part connection between the client and this protector to see, can we get some de-escalation from him right away today? Can we get some relationship going there? And we will do the healing as soon as we can. So the client had quite a foothold in regulation while we were with the Hulk. And then as soon as I suggested that we were going to go back, and when he was with the exile, and I said, we're going to go back and work with the Hulk, he started to get dysregulated again. He said some parts started to go crazy at the thought of him going back and working with the Hulk. So since his nervous system was in regulation and now starting to shift a little bit out of it, before we turn and befriend the Hulk, we have to kind of work a little bit with those parts who are dysregulated. So this is a neural exercise here in IFS. We're he's dipping his toe into dysregulation, then we're unblending and coming back into more regulation. Then he dips into a different kind of dysregulation, we're coming back. So you'll see that piece next week. I'm just going to check the chat here for a minute. Saskia, great question. Yeah, I guess you know this client pretty well, but he said, I want to cry for them with the young parts. Were you ever concerned this was a caretaking part? The caring energy wanted to reach out and touch the young boy, but that wasn't requested by the young part himself. Is there a risk this is a caretaking part that knows how to soothe? It's such a great question because sometimes it absolutely is. sometimes it's not actually the client's self, but another part who sees a distressed part and wants to like make it better. And what you're saying is accurate. This is a client that I do know well. I mean, before the pandemic, we had spent a couple of years together. And when he said that, knowing him as I know him, I know this comes from self. So I knew it would work. In other words, I knew that the energy that he had was really self. And the proof would be in the interaction that when he went to that young boy, just what happened, that his shoulders would melt down. He would start feeling safe. He was co-regulating, he was leaning his head on the client. So if I'm not sure, and maybe if I weren't sure with this client, but it sounded pretty good, I would actually maybe see how it's going, with the part. And if it's really working, then there's at least a critical mass of self there, because something I feel is that I actually have a great appreciation for self-like parts, for caretaking parts and all that. And I think they can be really valuable in the system. And I think a lot of times they have some self, that they're accessing some self. So maybe it's still a part that is bringing this energy, but maybe that self-like or caretaking part is still associated with some ventral activation in the nervous system. And therefore it's still a legitimately regulating force. So of course we eventually want self to part, just so we relieve those parts from their roles of having to caretake, having to soothe, and then establish the self as the one to turn to. But if it's going well enough, sometimes I'll go with it. Other times you'll hear me ask, can you check where this, this feeling of, wanting to cry for him, where it's coming from? Is it coming from you, from your heart? Is there a part feeling that way? So there are ways you can kind of check it out. Or if he sees himself going over to the boy, but he was saying, I'm putting my hand on his back. So that suggested to me he was seeing the part out of his own eyes. So with somebody else, I might have done a little more exploring. With him, I knew what that shift meant. So you're right. Yeah. And this is the question, MJ, even if it were a caretaking part, what would happen if that part got to cry with him? How is that risky? And, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's really helpful. It's still someone in there being with that part. And for some of our clients, sometimes for some of ourselves, I started that way. Sometimes the best we can get for a while is that a part of us who's very caring or very nurturing can be present with one of our exiles. And that is a step toward being able to have self-part connection. And so I don't ever want to call out those self-infused, self-like, there's so many names for them now, the parts that have a lot of qualities of self. Don't want to be shaming toward them, don't want to exile them. I do want to relieve them of having to be overly responsible. But it's okay. If I know it's that, I will try to see if the part would be willing to, maybe be there with, and also let the client be there. So from the video, we've already been seeing a little bit here. We'll see a lot more in next week's segments, and hearing a few things about working with hyper-aroused systems and parts that are associated with sympathetic survival. So on this slide, I'll give you a few more specific tips on working with these kinds of hyper-aroused parts. And I want to point out that a good bit of the information on this slide was influenced by Frank Anderson, who many of you may already know. He's a senior IFS trainer. He's done a lot of teaching about the neuroscience behind IFS. So he offers some very specific strategies on how do we work with parts of our clients that are characterized by hyperarousal, or the way I see it from a polyvagal perspective, parts that are living in, or that are strategically using, or that are themselves experiencing sympathetic energy. So highly anxious parts, worrying parts, panicked, scared, enraged, parts that want to run away, parts that want to aggressively defend. How do we approach them? So because of what's happening physiologically, when a client is blended with the energy of one of these types of parts, we as therapists or practitioners, we want to remain calm and non-reactive, and usually don't want to use too much empathy in these situations, meaning it's not ideal to have, our parts really resonating with the energy in the client system and then conveying that we're feeling similarly on some level to them. So we certainly want to be compassionate. We're engaged. We have a desire to help. We're very present. But if we start feeling with the client too much, if our parts are resonating a lot with their anger, with their frustration, with their anxiety, if it's kicking up that in our system, we really want to ask for space from those parts, because that can contribute, us lending our additional energy from our parts can contribute to an amplification, of their arousal. It can make it more intense. And then that's harder for them then to come into relationship with that part. So our job is, we want to stay calm, centered. Someone was asking about different qualities that you might bring in working with different types of parts. So a couple of things here. With hyper-aroused parts, I do like to stay really locked in. So non-verbally, they can see that attention-wise, that I'm right there with them. These hyper-aroused parts, they like to know they're being listened to, that they're being followed, that somebody is there with them, that we're really getting it, that we're really taking it in. It's making sense to us what they're saying. And they like to know sometimes that we can be in the presence of all their energy in a really steady and unwavering way, because usually they don't get that when there's too much anxiety in their system, when there's too much anger in their system. In some way, people will, disconnect from them or try to shut them down or try to make them calm or try to make them feel better. And us being able to stay engaged and stay interested and connected and really there with them in that energy is wonderful for them. It can also be useful to use, Frank Anderson talks about this, top-down strategies when these parts are very blended. So these are ways that we're helping the client think a little bit, activating some cognitive processes to help them make sense out of the reaction they're having, meaning to help them understand what's happening for them intellectually. Because as we bring their thinking brain back online a little bit, that helps downregulate their sympathetics. So we're trying to help them kind of move up to ventral a little bit. So accessing curiosity, that's why we're moving towards, is there a way that we can get them curious about what's happening inside of them instead of just in it, but noticing it, interested in it, So Frank says, if they're too aroused to think clearly at first about what's going on for them and to access the thinking parts of their brain, he says we can be the auxiliary brain for our clients in those moments. In those moments where they're so upset that their prefrontal cortex has shut down to some extent and they have less access to their capacity for their own rational thought. So as one of those top-down strategies, what we can do is validate and provide a rational perspective on what's going on. So we can say something, if they're blended with a part that's really panicking, we can say something like, yeah, it really makes sense that there's a part of you who's panicking right now. We just got very close to a young part that's in a lot of distress, and we haven't been this close before. And that can feel dangerous to some parts. So it really makes sense that a part of you is panicking in this moment. That makes sense. Does it make sense to you? So you're trying to get them to almost think about it like, oh, I guess that makes sense. And then we might say something like, so what do you hear this part saying to you about why it's afraid right now? Or we can ask things like, are you hearing from any parts that have a different perspective, or is everyone feeling equally scared inside? So then they're sort of paying attention in a different way. Before, they were just hyper aware of their physiological state and how uncomfortable and scary it is to feel panic happening in the body. And they're hyper focusing on their shortness of breath, their rapid heart rate, their sweaty, and when you focus on the physiological sensations when you're panicking, it gets worse. But to have them think, well, all of my parts scared, is anyone not scared in there? Or what is this part saying to you? Let me actually listen to what it's saying. So that's one thing you can do. Deb does it in a polyvagal way, saying things like, and that's your fight or flight system trying to protect you right now. It's come online right now to try to protect you. Let's get curious about that. So if you're not getting anywhere though with that, because that is requiring the client to do a little bit of noticing inside and hearing from the parts, you might have to use direct access. So if they're just lost in their panic, they're really blended, you might have to even use explicit direct access to say, Laura, I'd like to talk with the part of you that's panicking now. Is that okay? And if she says yes, you're saying, okay, I can see that you're really scared. If it's a protector and you don't know, so you can test it. What are you afraid might happen if you didn't flood Laura with all of your fear right now? You know, so you can ask that sort of a question. If it's a protector, it may give you an answer. It may say, well, yeah, if I don't make her feel this, she's going to go into a dangerous situation. Like she needs to feel this so that she doesn't just walk right back into that situation after the session or whatever. And we can bargain with them. We can negotiate with them, I guess the word is. Like, okay, if you can bring the intensity down just a little bit, just draw some of your energy out of Laura's body, she's going to be able to be with you and actually hear from you about these concerns. And we can think about, you know, how to handle this, if you'd be willing to do that. So sometimes they are able to do that. But somebody, I think, asked something in the chat last week about, well, what happens if a part is really blended and just the suggestion to unblend a little or to draw some of their energy out actually upsets them further? You know, so in the case of panic, sometimes what's in exile blending, they might say, I can't, I'm not doing this for any reason. You know, I'm feeling this, I can't do anything about it. You know, and the idea of pulling their energy out, they, you know, they're capable of doing it, but they may not know they are. So you can stay with the direct access then and say, yeah, I see how strong the panic feelings are right now. And you can offer them external co-regulation. You can say, try this, you know, really notice me here with you. You know, I'm right here. You're not alone. I know your body's having some reactions right now. Just feel me here with you. If it feels okay, you can look in my eyes. You can feel my energy. You can feel my presence. Know we're here together. And, you know, we're going to be here together as your body comes down out of this reaction. And sometimes that sort of thing of having somebody know they're not alone in what feels like a terrifying state, because a lot of times when they've been in these survival states, especially in their history, they were in that totally alone. So to just have someone with them, looking at them. So you're using your social engagement system, the cues from your face, your tone of voice, your eyes, to try to activate their social engagement system a little bit, which will bring some ventral online, which will downregulate that sympathetic activation. You can also use body regulating techniques with them in that way, as long as it's not exiling. So if the part is saying, I can't, you know, I can't stop this, I can't do anything about it, whatever, okay, would you like to try breathing together? You know, so the part is not feeling exiled by this, the part is asking for a way to help bring the body into regulation. So you're not doing it to them, you're not doing it to get rid of them, you're not doing it to not listen to them, you're doing it because they're saying, I'm suffering and I want some help with this. So we can breathe together. And so you can coach them using, you know, Deb will recommend things like, let's really extend the exhale, you know, so you can breathe together with a long, slow exhale with some resistance, which can bring some ventral online, kind of, again, down regulating the sympathetic. So you can use other things then if you need to, as long as you're doing it in connection with the part, in collaboration with the part. And again, back to the question from before about, are there different qualities you might use? You know, self itself has many different qualities, and the ones that I find probably most helpful to embody and then convey when working with a hyper-aroused client are calm, clarity, and confidence. So those qualities being conveyed from my nervous system to the clients can have a very containing effect. You know, they have the sense I'm being held in safety by a competent other, basically. It helps them feel that I might be experiencing a lot, but I'm in the presence of somebody who can hold this and who's very stable with it and unwavering it in the face of this, just right here with me. And I do want to say, though, it is important to me that I'm saying some general guidelines in terms of how do we approach hyper-aroused parts, but I don't want to state it in absolute terms, because, you know, when we've done enough work with clients that there's no rule that's going to hold 100% of the time. So when I'm working with hyperaroused parts, I'll try to use some of this. So my default would be to ask any parts of me that might be reactive to the hyperarousal to give me space so that I'm embodying that calm and that clarity and that confidence. Use direct access if I need to, trying to use the top down to help them make sense of it. Direct access if I need to, all of that. Other techniques if I need to. But I'm really watching to see how's this landing with the client system. Because if the approach isn't landing well, and you know that because they'll start to, they'll escalate even further, or they won't be moving toward any place where there's more self-available, then I'll say, okay, I might be using the guidelines on the slide, but that's not attuned with what this client needs in this moment. So I'll shift it. So as an example of that, I was working with a client who was very, very angry during the session because literally she got the call in our session from her fertility doctor's office. They had told her to stop the treatment that she was doing that month in order to be able to harvest eggs at the end of her cycle for IVF. And then they realized they shouldn't have told her to stop the treatment. She should have gone through to the end of the cycle and done the harvesting. And they had made a mistake and they told her this, and it was just really upsetting for her, very understandably. So she's really angry, but very blended with the part who's angry. And so I was sitting with her in, this more of this clear and caring and present way, but more from an unblended place. And she just kept escalating. She was more and more and more angry. So this isn't really doing anything helpful for her right now. So basically, I started to allow some of my parts to resonate with hers, parts of mine that could feel some frustration and anger on her behalf for how their error had impacted her. So I started to allow that frustration to come into my own body and convey that, that I felt frustrated with her, actually. And that immediately shifted things for her. She just immediately, it's like her system de-escalated and she said, thank you. The worst part of this fertility journey has been feeling so utterly alone in it. Basically, everyone's either trying to give me hope or telling me it's going to work out, or it's going to making me feel calm. And I just need someone to be angry with me. This sucks, So in that moment for that client, the parts of her that were hyper aroused and angry, for absolutely good reason, they just wanted connection. And that's what they were not getting from anyone. So they kept escalating because they weren't getting what they needed. So that's the important thing to say. We might have some guidelines overall, but we are always doing what we do as attuned therapists and practitioners, seeing, okay, how is this landing? What's happening in the system? If it's going well, fine. If not, we might need to shift. And just finally, I talked in our session last week about how one of the things that our parts are capable of doing is that they can make strategic use of our autonomic states. So to give you an example, from my practice, the client gave me permission for this. One of my clients, she identified a part that she called volcano, and it's not the same client as last week that had a volcano part. Because a lot of people have volcanoes. So when we started the session, she was just talking directly to me about this part. So she was telling me, okay, it's a part of me that when it blends, it makes me really angry and very critical and very shaming toward my husband. So I judge him, how he spends his time for not helping me around the house with our baby girl. When I'm the one who makes most of the money, I have so many more responsibilities than he does. And so this part, when it blends, it has her just lash out at him with anger, with shaming, with criticism, and a lot of negative thoughts about him and negative feelings toward him. So, in IFS fashion, she found the part in her body. It was a burning energy in her chest. She saw an image of it. It was an erupting volcano. And when I first asked her how she felt toward it to gauge, do we have that critical mass of self to befriend volcano? She responded from a blended place. She was actually blended with a part that does not like volcano because it feels that it's not right to shame her husband. And that part is really afraid she's going to drive him away. So we unblended from that part. Then she was open to connecting with volcano. And it shared its positive intention. And its positive intention was to make her husband consider her needs. Instead of just focusing on his own comfort, what he needed to do all the time. So this was making sense to the client, what the protector was trying to do. And she asked Volcano, when did you first take on this role of protecting me by having me kind of lash out in this shaming and critical way so that I can get noticed, so that I can get needs met? And literally in the session, just right there immediately, it showed her an image of herself at 9 years old. She's the oldest of 5 siblings. And her mother was just a wonderful, really intelligent person, but very overwhelmed with 5 children and was in graduate school too at the time. Her father was absent, just wasn't around. So this client, as the oldest and the responsible one, she would help her mother take care of 4 younger siblings, get straight A's in school, make sure that she never did anything that would cause her mother any trouble or any stress. So the client's remembering all this as she sees this image of herself when she was very young. And she could remember being really well behaved in school and really well behaved around her mother, but then secretly lashing out at her siblings in these shaming and critical ways when her mother was not around. So she asked the protector what it was afraid might happen, it's the 6th F, if it didn't make her go after her husband in this shaming way. And it immediately said, you'll be alone. You won't matter. There will be no room for your needs. You'll be invisible. It just right away kind of rattled all that off. And not only did that make sense to the client, but as she started to say it, she started to get pulled down into the dorsal survival state, just as she was even saying this. So she started to blend with the 9-year-old version of herself, who was still stuck back there, lying on her bed at night after a full day of caring for 4 younger children, trying to be perfect for mom, all of this. And she was feeling so alone and so uncared for. She started to get drawn into that energy. So in the session, she unblended and she worked with that exile. But the reason I bring up this example is Volcano is an example of a part that can strategically bring on sympathetic survival state and energies for a purpose. And the purpose is to keep the client out of a dorsal collapse. So what was happening for the client whenever she'd see her husband sitting on the couch with a laptop and a beer, and while she was endlessly working and having the baby, she would immediately just feel this sinking in her stomach. She would start to go to that place of dorsal invisibility, of not mattering, of not being seen, of not being attended to. And Volcano would rush right in, come in so fast, flood her with the sympathetically driven anger. She'd act right from that blended place, which of course was hard on her, hard on the relationship, but not as hard as what Volcano feared would happen to her if she sunk into dorsal. It would rather have her up in this angry, aggressive, critical, shaming place, rather that than have her down in that dorsal place. So it's an example how if we know about kind of the hierarchy of autonomic response, it can be helpful. Parts usually don't want us to go down into dorsal collapse. It can be a life-threatening state if it's severe enough, but also it's just a very lonely, lost, sometimes hopeless, disconnected place. And so some parts can specifically take on roles to prevent us from going to that place that involve pulling us up into sympathetic, because in some nervous systems, sympathetic feels like a safer place to be. So I'm going to take a look in the chat here right before we end and see. Oh, wow. Oh, Fiona, that's, wow. So even with animals, the ability to co-regulate, looking in their eyes, helping them to come back up from a place of immobilization. Wow. Okay. And let me just stop for a minute. We stop the share here. I think we've answered everything in the chat. And like I said, there will be some questions that from last time that will be addressed next time when we go into talking about hypo-aroused parts. And there were some questions that were related to that. Is there anything else for today before we end? Make sure to save the chat if you asked questions or if you want to see answers to other people's questions, because there's a lot that's been written in there as well. Okay. Oh, thank you. I will thank the client. I always tell him whenever I use his sessions how much it means to people, and it means a lot to him, that his work might help someone else. So thank you all so very much for today. And thank you for your sweet messages too. And I will see you next week. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh. Okay, I'll see you next week. Oh.
Thank you, Lexi. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to unmute, guys. And
Thanks, Lexi.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you very
much.
much.
Thank you.